Hello, this is Andrea, and this is another in my doodling around with the idea of a podcast. My apologies for the long delay since I last did something. My little dog had a sort of cascade of health problems. He got asthma, which may have been related to some mildew problems we finally resolved after almost a year. Then he was put on prednisone to treat the asthma. The prednisone gave him sudden onset diabetes, which created its own huge set of problems, which involved being awake every 3 hours at night to save the carpet. And then he got pancreatitis, which almost killed him. So the last week and a half have been tiring. And I had to put podcasting to the side. But I am back and I have got some fun stuff to do. So hold on to your hats and let's have fun. Before I get to the meat of the podcast, there are a couple of things I want to bring to your attention. One is something I actually wrote about already for American Thinker, but it struck me so strongly I wanted to share it with you. It's an essay from the New Statesman, which is a very hard left publication. It was started in England in 1913 by Beatrice and Sidney Webb, who were basically the founders of the Fabian movement. And Fabians were these upper-class Brits who dreamed of a socialist paradise in England brought about through persuasion rather than bloodshed. And the publication is still hard left, and the author of this essay, Bruno Macias, I have no idea how to pronounce the Portuguese name, is also hard leftist, and he's a regular columnist for them, and he worked in the Portuguese government. And he wrote an essay entitled Letter from Michigan. No one I know is voting for Kamala Harris. And the subtitle is, Will Donald Trump Win the Struggling Swing State? And he describes going to a rally at the beginning of October in Warren, Michigan. And he said he really wasn't interested in Trump because, correctly, we all know about Trump, which is why these claims that Trump is Hitler and Trump assaulted a woman 31 years ago and she just suddenly decided to talk about it now, everything falls flat because people know Trump. He's not Hitler. But one of the things he said two interesting things in it. One, he said that Arabs want peace in the Middle East, Arab Americans, and so no one is voting for Kamala Harris, to whom he spoke amongst the Arab American community. So Kamala and Biden, for all that they shivved Israel throughout the last year as Israel's tried to destroy existential enemies and simply live in peace in that tiny little enclave in a sea of Islam, it was for naught because Muslims, it turns out, while they care very deeply about what's happening in the Middle East and have agitators who are screaming about genocide and this and that, what they really care about is what everybody else cares about: a good economy, a strong border, safe streets, their children not being turned into sexual monsters, and Kamala's not offering that. But what struck me so much is this paragraph that I'll read aloud to you verbatim from his essay, and it's a kind of read it and just literally weep, because he describes what Democrats have done to America, although he, being a leftist, would not admit to it. Quote, "It may be difficult for Europeans to understand how dysfunctional much of America has become. Nothing works. Bathrooms in bus stations and fast food joints have often been closed for months. Public facilities are invariably old. Streets are spectacularly dirty. Service workers may go on small local strikes no one hears about. Supermarket shelves may be empty because of shoplifters. In Erie, Pennsylvania, 2 days before the Warren campaign event, I took a train in the middle of the night. Outside the station, the homeless begged to enter the waiting room, only to be denied by the station master, who promptly fell asleep on the floor. I was told that many people try to jump on moving freight trains as they have no money for tickets. Once the station master woke up from his drunken slumber, he told me a bum had been run over by a moving train while sleeping on the tracks just a few days before. Now he worries because no one is checking the tracks every night." That is what Democrat governance looks like. Incidentally, at the end of the essay, or actually about halfway through, Macias, or however you pronounce his name, says that he thinks Trump will win. And Trump will win because he speaks up for the people whose world has been destroyed by 16 years of leftist governance with a small Trump interval during which the left pushed back at everything he did. Again, not that Messiah says that. He doesn't have to. His descriptions say it for him. The next thing I want to bring to your attention is an essay at a site called Pirate Wires, PW, by someone named Ashley Rinsberg. It was published a couple of days ago, didn't get a lot of press, and it's entitled How Wikipedia's Pro-Hamas Editors Hijacked the Israel-Palestine Narrative. Subtitle, A Powerful Group of Editors is Hijacking Wikipedia, Pushing Pro-Palestinian propaganda, erasing key facts about Hamas, and reshaping the narrative around Israel with alarming influence. Now, this matters more than you may realize. Many of you may have seen the video the other day of Ben Shapiro debating a group of young people on a variety of issues. 25 people surrounded him. He debated them all. The one that got a lot of airplay was a young woman who insisted that abortion didn't mean the death of a fetus. Well, everybody's laughing at her. What a dodo. How can she not know that? I was going to write a post about what a dodo. How can she not know that? So what I did was I did what I usually do, which is I start with a definition. And that's when I discovered something interesting. Merriam-Webster is the only site I could find that acknowledges that abortion results in the death of a baby. All the other sites, Wikipedia, World Health Organization, a health publication of the National Institutes of Health, the Harvard Health Newsletter, they all talk about it ending or terminating a pregnancy. It doesn't say that the baby dies, which explains why that young woman who threw around enough academic gobbledygook to make me think that she was college educated truly did not understand that abortion means a baby dies. And so she was going on about it being like a C-section, and you're not opposed to C-section, or you're not opposed to women giving birth, because she didn't know, because there are no resources in this Orwellian world telling her that. So the analogy, of course, is if Wikipedia is rewriting history, if it's memory holing the legitimate past, and there are 40 editors who are simply faking the past, you're going to get people like that young woman who are absolutely certain of their false data because they have no access to real data. So what's happening is that around 40 Wikipedia editors are in on this. They're presenting radical Islamist groups as favorable people. They're going to fringe academics as reliable authority. And this has been going on for a long time, if you know Wikipedia, but it's gotten worse. In the 6 weeks after October 7th, and I'm quoting, one of these editors successfully removed mention of Hamas's 1988 charter, which calls for the killing of Jews and the destruction of Israel, from the article on Hamas. The other thing, that's the end quote, the other things the groups have done is they're promoting the Iranian government and deleting anything negative about Iranian officials. A group called Tech for Palestine has launched a whole campaign against Israel, and it violated Wikipedia policies, but that didn't stop it. And so there's all sorts of really dishonest stuff going on, so that Wikipedia, which we all know is left-wing, is now no longer merely left-wing, but is blatantly dishonest through omission and commission. So something to think about, which is, how do you stop this madness? And how do you steer young people to honest information when they are living in a world that Big Brother would strongly support? So this one is it. This is the meat of the podcast. The New York Times is frantically trying to keep Trump from winning. So what they're doing is presenting a parade of horribles, the awful things about Donald Trump. And what's so funny is Donald Trump's campaign could not have done a better job of putting together a short and powerful advertisement for his campaign. After I read this, there was only one thing with which I disagreed, and everything else I'm going, hell yes. You didn't have to persuade me. I was already going to go vote for him, but now, well, actually, I already did vote for him, which is a reminder. All of you, if you haven't already done early voting, go vote now. And that's true even if you're in a blue state, because my friend Anonymy, we published one of Anonymy's posts at American Thinker, and what Anonymy believes is that the reason Trump is campaigning in states where he's not expected to win at all, for example, New York, where he's currently doing the Madison Square Garden rally as I'm talking, is because he wants to win the national vote. So he wants enough people in America to vote for him that he is the most legitimate president ever. So even if you're in a blue state, if you're in California or Massachusetts or Colorado or Oregon or Washington, vote, because whatever your state does, Trump wants everybody to see that Americans are behind him, whether they're in red or blue or swing states. In any event, and vote early, because the deal is we want Trump to have won before November 5th, because that means it's impossible to cheat. If he's already won, if there are enough votes that there can be no more votes for him to lose, then he's in like Flynn. So vote, go do it in person, make sure that the voting machine correctly records your vote, and make a difference. But anyway, the New York Times panicked. So it did a Sunday opinion piece. The whole page is one giant headline. And I found this, a leftist said, "Well done, New York Times." And what it says is, Donald Trump says he will prosecute his enemies, order mass deportations, use soldiers against citizens, abandon allies, play politics with disasters. Believe him. Well, funnily enough, I wasn't able to find that specific article, although I didn't look very hard. What I found instead was something that was even better. It is an article entitled "If Trump Wins," and it was put together by Charlie Savage, Jonathan Swan, and Maggie Haberman. So fanatic leftists, all of them. And it's absolutely wonderful because it is a brief summary of everything that people want Trump to do. Well, not quite everything, because there are larger issues of we want the economy to be better. We want our standing in the world to be better. We want our children to stop being trans. We want peace in the Middle East. But to the extent it talks about 6 issues, yes, stand up and cheer. Thank you, New York Times, for your persuasive pro-Trump writing. So let me just go through it, and then that'll wrap this up. So the first thing is Trump will crack down on illegal immigration to an extreme degree. Quote, Mr. Trump is planning a massive expansion of his first-term crackdown on immigration if he returns to power in 2025. Now, I happen to know from the polls American Thinker has been doing that Americans across the board, including in blue states and definitely in swing states, hate illegal immigration. It's one of their primary concerns. They want it to stop. They think it should be the incoming president's first priority, and they're hugely in favor of deporting illegal aliens. So here are the 6 things that the New York Times says Trump will do. Carry out mass deportations. Hell yes. Increase the number of agents for ICE raids. Hell yes. Build camps to detain immigrants. Well, if you're going to mass deport them, you need to assemble them someplace, and they're not even, it's not immigrants, it's illegal aliens. So it's the equivalent of you got to hold them somewhere. So yeah, it seems icky, but they're not like the Japanese Americans whom Franklin Roosevelt interned during World War II. These are people who are criminals merely by virtue of being here. I'm not so sad. Going back to the list. Push for other countries to take would-be asylum seekers from the United States. Hell yes. Once again, ban entry into the United States by people from certain Muslim-majority nations. Hell yes. Try to end birthright citizenship. Hell yes. Just because someone sneaks into the country, overstays a visa, whatever, Why should their children suddenly have all the rights and benefits of American citizens? That's not the way it works. Cheating should not be a reward. So, hell yes on the crackdown on illegal immigration to an extreme degree. Makes me want to vote for Trump more. Next one is use the Justice Department to prosecute his adversaries. And this one you just have to laugh aloud when you read it. Mr. Trump has declared that he would use the powers of the presidency to seek vengeance on his perceived foes. His allies have developed a legal rationale to erase the Justice Department's independence from the president. Now, I want you to think about the war against Donald Trump, the federal prosecutions against him, the Biden administration's coordination with D.C. and Georgia for state prosecutions against him, the prosecutions against the January 6th defendants, many of whom are now being forgotten, and many of whom should be released now that the Supreme Court has said that the prosecution office and complicit judges completely abused legal standards about interfering with official proceedings. Those laws were about interfering with witnesses, suborning perjury, threatening prosecutors. They weren't about protesting at the Senate for regarding a vote. I mean, the whole thing has been thousands of people's lives have been destroyed as the Justice Department went after Democrat adversaries. And anybody who was aligned with Trump has been prosecuted and persecuted. They've been driven from their professions. So this self-righteous huffing and puffing about how dare Trump talk about going after people. I mean, how dare he? So what the list is that Trump has said he'll direct a criminal investigation into Mr. Biden and his family. Well, I completely agree, because especially if you read Miranda Devine's new book about Mr. Big, it's patently clear that Biden, when he was vice president and after, abused all sorts of government powers to funnel money to his family, and that it's very likely that the whole war in Ukraine is a payback. I mean, it ended up destroying Ukraine, but it was a payback for all the money that flowed to him. I mean, the corruption in the Biden family is unbelievable. Have foes indicted for challenging him politically. Well, Trump's not going to do that. It's not how dare you politically challenge me. But yes, if they violated the law in some way, yeah. I mean, game theory says that when someone cheats, especially cheats against you, or simply changes the rules against you, the only way to win is to go back at them using their own rules, but playing so hard they cry uncle. And then 3, target journalists for prosecution. Now, I don't quite remember the context in which Trump said this. Journalists have defamed him something awful. And one of the problems, I think it was in the Supreme Court in the Sullivan case, New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court gave journalism carte blanche to lie about people. And most of it, if you're a famous person, you can slough it off. But the lies that have been told about Trump are evil and have resulted in things like his being persecuted and prosecuted. So again, if they're doing something illegal, they should be prosecuted. And it would be interesting to see the Supreme Court revisit defamation laws, because there ought to be limits, at least some limits, on what you can say about public figures. Not too many limits, because that harms free speech. But there has to be some sort of, the checks and balances maybe. I don't want to opine on that too much because I haven't thought it through. Next thing that the New York Times is fulminating about, use military force in Mexico and on American soil. And Mr. Trump has been more clear about his plans for using U.S. military force closer to home. Now, what I want you to remember is when Biden was sworn in, the Democrats turned Washington, D.C. into an armed, fortified camp. They flooded it with, 25,000 National Guardsmen? And that was okay. So what they're saying is Trump has said he'll declare war on drug cartels in Mexico. Well, that's absolutely appropriate. Drug cartels are waging a war complete with weapons, murders, drugs, crime, suborning, all sorts of horrible crimes in court, in politics. So it is a war, and it's appropriate to use our military on a war against a foreign enemy. Use federal troops at the border. It is an invasion. It is entirely appropriate to use our troops to defend America against a foreign invasion. I can't understand why he didn't use it during his first term. And in fact, given how the Mexican government is completely complicit in this, I mean, the Mexican government relies on the remissions. It uses illegal immigration into the U.S. just the way Venezuela does to empty its prisons, just the way Cuba once did. It gives people maps to come here. And of course, the Mexican government is completely controlled by the cartels. So frankly, to wage war on the cartels, even if it means entering into Mexico, might save Mexico. You destroy the cartels, you might return Mexico's government to sanity and help Mexico again become a viable nation instead of the basket case across our border. And then finally, use federal troops on American soil. You cannot use federal troops under posse comitatus to wage war against American citizens. That's from, I think, 1878. What you can do, and what presidents have done repeatedly, I mean, Wilson did it, Coolidge did it, Eisenhower did it, Johnson did it, is when there's federal unrest in American cities, you can use the National Guard. The president, and remember, Eisenhower did it to get schools integrated in the South after Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, the president can use troops to quell riots and unrest on American soil. For the left to treat it as this is something that only a fascist would do, only a Nazi, is absolutely ridiculous. There are constitutional parameters, but it is not foreclosed. Now, this is a funny one. These are all funny because the New York Times is so upset about these entirely appropriate things. Increased presidential power. Mr. Trump and his associates have a broad goal to alter the balance of power by increasing the president's authority over every part of the federal government that currently operates independently of the White House. Well, the federal government should not be operating independently of the White House. There are three branches of government: the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. And the people have elected the president to be the big boss of the executive. Anything that operates independently of the big boss of the executive is unconstitutional and needs to be done away with or brought within the control of the executive. So these are the 5 things that horrify the Democrats at the New York Times. Bring independent agencies under presidential control. Well, yes. The next one is the only one I have some questions about, because I don't know enough about it. So I'm not saying yay or nay. I'm pleading ignorance. Revive the practice of impounding funds, which means that the president can sequester and not spend funds that the Congress has allocated to a certain task. So, for example, if a Democrat Congress said that they want to have $100 million allocated to helping children with their gender-affirming care, I assume that impounding funds means that the president could say, oh, not doing that. I don't know. So I'm not making a call on that. The next, strip employment protections from tens of thousands of longtime civil servants. What that actually means is, yes, the president can and should fire people who work for the executive branch. John F. Kennedy did a terrible thing. It was a favor to the mob when he unionized the federal government. And I'm forgetting the number of the executive order, 9017, or I forget what it was. But as even Franklin Roosevelt realized, you cannot have a unionized federal workforce. At a monetary level, it means that the legislature should be setting wages, because when it's unionized, you have a government representative whom the union has bought and the union boss, and they're negotiating with money that comes from us, the taxpayers, who are the only people who are not at the table. The whole thing is outrageous. It ought never to have been done. Their job security is ridiculous. I would suggest that there is somehow more latitude with how pensions work, because I've long had the feeling that a lot of federal employees are handcuffed by their reliance on certain pension benefits that they lose if they leave the federal government. Anyway, I'm somewhat ignorant about that too, so don't quote me on it. Number 4, purge officials from intelligence agencies, law enforcement, the State Department, and the Pentagon. You betcha. All of these people report to the president. The president was elected based upon the will of the American people. If these people are working against the president, as all of them did during Trump's first administration, they need to go. And the last thing is appoint lawyers who would bless his agenda as lawful. Well, yes, if they can make a colorable, credible claim based on statutory law and case precedent, absolutely he should have lawyers who are his advocates within the government. That's how it's supposed to work. The next New York Times promotional thing for Donald Trump is upend trade and other economic policies. I'm quoting, "At the risk of disrupting the economy in hopes of transforming it, Mr. Trump plans to impose new tariffs on most goods manufactured abroad." And then they have this usual economists, whoever they are, say his broader agenda, including on trade, deportations, and taxes, could cause prices to rise. As if they haven't risen on Biden and Kamala's watch, because Biden and Kamala have been printing money like crazy. They've raised regulations. They've increased lawsuits. They use the Justice Department as a cudgel against businesses. I could go on and on. Trump has said he'll impose a universal baseline tariff on a new tax on most imported goods. You know, this is how the government made money right up until 1913, when the progressives instituted an income tax, which I believe they promised would never exceed 1%. So there's nothing that radical about tariffs. As Don Sturber likes to point out all the time, Abraham Lincoln was big on tariffs. There is nothing wrong, especially when you're dealing with other countries that are not comparably situated. So if we have balanced and fair trade with Germany and the U.S., that's one thing. But when you have it with a country that's fantastically poor, that country becomes as, what was that little Texan back in the 90s said? Totally blanked on his name, but all of you are thinking of it while I say it, when he said there's going to be a giant sucking sound, and he was absolutely right, because what happened is the factories went straight to Mexico. They go to China, they go to India. It's great. It raises the standard of living of people in China and India, but going back to the earlier part of this podcast, it creates American cities that are vast wastelands. Part of that is disastrous Democrat governance on crime and things like that. Part of it is because the Democrats have given away the whole American economy to the third world. Speaking of which, number 2 is that Trump has said he'll implement steep new trade restrictions on China. China is even worse in places like India or Mexico, because they're just, hey, we're here, we're cheaper, bring your factories here. China uses its government to deliberately undercut the American economy. And you and I know that you can't buy anything anymore that isn't made in China. It's all made in China. And the thing is, as we discovered during COVID, our medicines are made in China or in India. Those should be brought home. Anything essential should be brought home. And then there are things like you put a tariff. Joe Biden claimed he was putting a tariff on Chinese goods, but in fact, China was now manufacturing them in Mexico. So it was just a shell game. And the whole thing is disgraceful, and an American president should protect the American people from these games. Slash rules imposed on business interests. Yes, one of the things the Biden administration has done is this form of lawfare, where they attack businesses and then force them into coercive settlements, because a business has to pay for lawyers, whereas as a government, the taxpayer pays for lawyers. And the FDA was created back in the early 1900s when dozens of children were killed when someone put, I think it was antifreeze in cough medicine to make it taste better, or some other medicine. I am all for some regulation. The reason San Francisco didn't collapse like a pancake in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake is because we had sensible building codes to keep us from looking like Mexico City or cities in China and Iran or Turkey when there's an earthquake. But as always, there is a balance. When I was on the board of my kids' little elementary school, we had a capital campaign and we built new things. And one of the things was that there was a fence built around the playground for the toddler area. And that fence was required to have a push bar for an emergency exit. Except you can't have a push bar for an emergency exit where toddlers play. Instead, you have to have the exit switch much higher. But because of the rigidity of regulations, our school had to spend $1,000 to buy and install the push bar, and then they had to spend another $200 to disable it. We had to put a wheelchair ramp in, and wheelchair ramps are also great for strollers. So I'm not complaining about wheelchair ramps. They actually serve mothers well too. It turned out that the contractor had done the wheelchair ramp a 1/4 inch too narrow, and he was made to take it apart and rebuild it at a cost to him of something like $100,000. Somewhere along the line, that cost got passed on. It was insane. And this is when you say slash rules imposed on business interests. Well, maybe some of those rules need to be slashed. And then there was extend and expand tax cuts. And one of the things is lower the corporate tax rate. I was listening to Dan Bongino today debate with Schenk or whatever, Uyghur, the young Turk who can be sometimes sensible, but he wants tax. He agrees that there's too much government spending, that the government doesn't monitor its spending well. It's not just that a lot of money is allocated to things that we ought not to be spending money on. He'd spend less on military, I'm sure, and more on the Department of Education. I would end the Department of Education altogether. But it's also that a lot of it is just lost. The money is just lost through inefficiency. But what he wants to do is tax corporations more and more and more and more. And Dan Bongino tried to explain to him that corporations don't pay taxes. Everything you charge to a corporation in the form of taxes eventually gets passed through to the consumers. So the way it works is when you tax a corporation, yes, maybe the shareholders get less money, the employees get less money, and the consumers pay more. So any tax on a corporation hurts consumers, whether they're investing in a good business and then seeing their money go to their profits vanish, whether they're paying more for goods and services, or whether they're taking less money home in salaries. So, slash the corporate tax rate. It'll bring more business into America and put more money into Americans' pockets, which is why when Reagan and Bush slashed corporate tax rates, more money flowed into the Treasury because Americans were making more money, business was thriving, the pie was expanding. All leftists think the pie is only so big and no bigger, and you just have to ream any money where you can find it. So the last thing is retreat from military engagement with Europe. Mr. Trump has long made clear that he sees NATO, the country's most important military alliance, not as a force multiplier with allies, but as a drain on American resources by freeloaders. So, Trump has said he'll potentially undercut NATO or withdraw the United States from the alliance. If I know Trump, that's posturing. What Trump will do is once again make Europe pay its fair share. It's outrageous that America is funneling money to protect Europe, especially now because Europe is so anti-American. Europe is increasingly Islamicized. I mean, we are paying money to protect a continent that is becoming an enemy of America. Maybe if Europe has to pay for its own costs, it will start taking an interest in its own defense. The other thing is, he said he'll settle the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. This is a war that ought never to have happened. It happened because what most people don't realize is that the area that Russia wanted is completely Russified. That already started in the 1930s under Stalin. And yes, Putin is pushing and pushing and pushing, but that area is not only Russified, but it is an area where Ukraine was really attacking the Russified people there, people whose allegiance really was more to Russia. The other thing that people forget is that there was no reason ever for Ukraine to join NATO. And Putin said that's a red line, just as we would say it's a red line for Putin to set up shop, or China to set up shop in Mexico. Although, of course, China has set up shop in Mexico, and we're just inviting people in. Different subject. So, on the one hand, Putin wanted a territory that's already been essentially made Russian over the last 90 years. And on the other hand, he's saying, Europe, stay away. Ukraine is a buffer state. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. So what did Biden do? He doubled down on taunting Putin. So the whole war never should have happened. Someone said very intelligently that what should have happened was that Putin should have bought the contested land. It would have given money to Ukraine. Putin would have gotten the region he wanted and keep NATO out of there. So this was an absolutely unnecessary war. It's destroyed Ukraine, hundreds of thousands dead, millions relocated, and it made a lot of money for people who have ties to the Biden and industries who have ties to the Biden. It's a disgrace. It ought never to have started, and I do believe Trump when he says he'll end the war. So anyway, thank you, New York Times, for making such an incredibly clean, clear, overwhelming case for why Donald Trump should be returned for a second term in the presidency. And on that note, I hope I come back sooner rather than later. My dog seems to be doing very well. I'm still not sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch at night, so I'm still functioning somewhat subpar. And this coming week is going to be insanely busy, but I will try to come back with another podcast.